He had everything, money, fame, power, but he lost what truly mattered. And when he finally found the woman he loved again, pregnant, quietly serving tables, it was like taking a punch from life itself. But the worst was yet to come, because that belly might have been hiding a secret he was never prepared to face. Do you know what's going to happen? I don't think so. Get ready for a story that will destroy you from the inside and rebuild you at the end. Oh, and if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories and help us reach more people. It was a cold, gray night in New York. The wind cut through the bustling streets, and the city lights reflected in the puddles accumulated on the sidewalks. In the heart of Manhattan, the restaurant Le Bonheur, a sophisticated refuge for the rich and famous, was illuminated like a beacon of luxury. It was there that Charles Thompson, one of New York's most successful businessmen, liked to conduct his business dinners. He never imagined that night would be different. Charles, now 55, looked like the portrait of success. His Armani suit, gold watch, and calculated smile gave the impression that he had everything under control. He walked toward a private table where an important investor awaited him. The conversation flowed professionally, but deep down, something bothered him. In recent months, he felt that his life, despite appearing flawless on the surface, was empty. The glamour of parties, million-dollar contracts, and business victories couldn't fill the space of loneliness he felt. As he sat down, however, a familiar but unexpected sound caught his attention, a soft, almost timid voice that seemed to echo through the restaurant. "Here's your order, sir. Please let me know if you need anything else." Charles turned quickly. His gaze met a pair of deep eyes filled with history. It was Shirley Ann Adams, the woman he had left behind more than 15 years ago. He recognized her instantly, though she looked different, more mature, but still with the same intense sparkle in her eyes. She didn't notice his presence immediately as she was busy with the tray of dishes. She seemed different too, not just from the years that had passed, but in the way she moved now, with serene grace as if time had taught her the importance of patience and self-care. He watched her, unable to look away. The pain of the past began to invade his thoughts. Shirley, in turn, noticed someone was watching her and upon looking up, found Charles's eyes fixed on her. A silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Time seemed to have frozen. She was the first to break the silence, though her voice trembled slightly. "Charles," she said, without much emotion, but with slight surprise. "What are you doing here?" His expression was a mixture of shock and confusion. For a moment he felt vulnerable, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He tried to disguise the impact of that encounter, but it was impossible to hide. Shirley, with her hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing the waitress uniform, was there, in front of him after so many years. He wanted to do something, say something, but the words seemed unable to come out. I didn't know you worked here," he finally said, trying to hide the feeling of discomfort. "What happened to you?" Shirley looked at him without any trace of resentment, but with slight tension in her shoulders. "Life happens, Charles. Things change." She no longer expected anything from him, and that cold response reflected years of stored pain. Charles noticed something he hadn't seen before. Shirley was pregnant. The small curve of her belly didn't go unnoticed, and he frowned, wondering how long this had been a secret to him. He didn't know about the pregnancy, and didn't know how he felt about it. Are you pregnant?" He couldn't hide his surprise. She nodded, but offered no further explanation. It was evident she wanted nothing more from him, neither his curiosity nor his help. "Yes, I am, and if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to work now," she said, making a polite gesture to move away. "Shirley, wait," he said, standing up from the table. The scene caused a small commotion among the other customers around them, but he was beyond any embarrassment. "I need to know what happened. How are you doing?" She hesitated for a second, then looked into his eyes deeply. "I'm fine, Charles, and that's what matters now. I learned to move forward, despite everything. I don't need you. I don't need your pity or your money." She didn't want him to know, but the words came out almost involuntarily. The pain of that phrase was stamped on her face, and the silence that followed was heavy. Charles didn't know what to respond, because deep down, he knew she was right. He didn't know how he had let all this happen, how he had distanced himself so busy with success that he forgot about the people who really mattered. And now, there she was, stronger than ever, carrying something he had never known about. Shirley, still with the tray in her hands, made a subtle movement to step away. "I need to get back to work," she said, now with a softer voice. "Can you help me? If not, please, let me go my way." She didn't expect him to change, and had no intention of being trapped in the past. Her life had changed, and she no longer wanted to be reminded of the pain he had caused. The goodbye was quick, without further words. Charles, in turn, stood there, motionless, looking at the woman who had once been his wife. Now he felt something he had never experienced, an emptiness that no money or success could fill. He felt a wave of regret, but knew that winning Shirley back wouldn't be easy. More than 15 years ago, Charles Thompson and Shirley Ann Adams were the ideal couple. New York saw them as the definition of success. He, a rising businessman, and she, an intelligent woman full of life, who managed to balance her career and her role as wife and mother with enviable ease. They were in love, or at least, that's what it seemed to everyone around them. Their marriage began like a modern fairy tale. Charles was ambitious but was never as obsessed with money as most people thought. When he met Shirley, he saw in her something more than just a wife. She was his partner, his confidant. He felt that with her by his side, everything would be possible. They completed each other. Shirley loved Charles's enthusiasm, and his vision of the future seemed so clear and vibrant. He always said they would conquer the world together. At first, Shirley believed every word. She worked as a graphic designer, but her passion was being by his side, supporting him through long nights of meetings, projects he started and never finished, gala parties where they were both the main attraction. There was balance, or at least there seemed to be, but over time that balance began to break. Charles began to be absent more and more. His work, once an extension of his dreams, became an obsession. Meeting hours turned into entire days at the office. He began making international business trips, and weekends, which were once dedicated to family, became filled with work commitments. The marriage, once based on complicity, was being diluted by a growing lack of time and attention. Shirley tried, for months, to talk about how she felt. She felt she was losing connection with him. The small romantic dinners became rare, and the evening conversations on their apartment balcony, where they used to discuss the future, disappeared. She was patient for a while, believing he was just immersed in his projects. But as time passed, she began to realize it wasn't just work that was driving Charles away. It was indifference. His gaze no longer had the same tenderness. He seemed to no longer care about her, her insecurities, her fears, and finally about the daughter she carried in her womb, Sophia, her only inheritance of genuine love in that marriage. When Shirley discovered she was pregnant, the initial joy gave way to deep concern. She knew their marriage wasn't going well, but she couldn't ignore the fact that a new life was about to be born. She tried to talk to Charles about it, about the need to be by her side and build a family, but he was always too busy to listen. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months of silent waiting and frustration. It was during a dinner, when once again he was late arriving, that she finally made the decision that would change everything. When Charles entered the apartment, wearing his impeccable suit and with a tired smile, he looked at Shirley and said, "I just have one more appointment. Tomorrow I promise we'll talk." But she knew that tomorrow would never come. "Charles," she said, with a trembling but firm voice, "it's no use. I can't continue like this." He looked at her with surprise, not understanding the gravity of her words. He had built his empire with great effort, and the fact that Shirley had begun to question his dedication to work shook him more than he wanted to admit. But at the same time, he didn't know what else to do. He was lost in his own success. "Shirley, please. You know I'm doing this for us, for our security, for our daughter's future," he said, trying to justify his absence. But she no longer believed those empty words. "Security? Charles, the only thing you're giving us is distance, and that's not what a family needs," she replied, tears beginning to well up, but she kept them contained. "I can't wait anymore. You forgot about me. You forgot about us." He tried to approach to touch her, but she pulled away. It was too late. The words had already been said, and the pain she felt, the feeling of being left behind, was already unbearable. The divorce was quick and without major disputes. Charles wanted to believe this was best for everyone, that they would go separate ways and be happier that way. But the truth was, he didn't understand what he had lost until the moment Shirley was no longer by his side. And even with business success, with his bank account full and the world at his feet, he felt the deepest emptiness he had ever experienced. Life went on, and Charles tried to convince himself that his decision was the best. But always, deep down, he knew that the woman he truly loved had left. It wasn't the fortune, nor the luxury cars or luxurious apartments he built, but rather the love, the partnership he let slip away. And worse still, he never knew his daughter, a daughter who grew up without her father, without the support he should have given. The pain of not having been there for his daughter, for Shirley, was the most painful of all losses. And at that moment in the restaurant, seeing her again, he knew he would never be able to erase what had happened. Their lives had crossed paths, but he didn't know how to fix what was broken. Charles was used to controlling every detail of his life. His day was rigidly planned: meetings, conferences, business encounters. He woke up early, read reports, checked the stock exchanges and markets, always with the feeling that everything should be done the right way. That's how he felt safe. But there was something in his chest that he couldn't silence, a feeling he hadn't been able to identify until that encounter with Shirley. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. After that dinner at the restaurant, where his eyes had met Shirley's, he couldn't stop thinking about her. She was no longer in his life, but the image of her, pregnant and working in a simple place as a waitress, haunted him. He forced himself to concentrate on his company's profit spreadsheets, on conversations about new investments, but the memory of her was like a shadow, always present. Something he had ignored for years was beginning to reveal itself, and he didn't like what he saw. That night, after dinner, Charles went to his apartment. He entered, threw his keys on the table, and took an automatic look around. The environment was impeccable, as always. Everything was in place: the designer chairs, the rare bookshelf, the modern artwork on the walls. But something was strange. There was an emptiness. It was as if, despite the material perfection, the environment was asking for something more. The warmth of life, of coexistence, of connection was absent. It was when he sat on the sofa, in front of the living room mirror, that he realized the emptiness wasn't in the apartment. It was inside him, a deep loneliness that he tried to fill with success and wealth, but which now seemed more unbearable than ever. He, who had everything anyone could desire, felt a tightness in his heart, but he didn't know how to get rid of that feeling. That same night, he tried to call his secretary, asking to advance the planning of a new product line for the next season. But before doing that, he did something he had never done. He picked up the phone and dialed Shirley's number, without a clear reason. The phone rang, but before she answered, he hung up. The doubt returned, squeezing him like a dense cloud. Does she still think about me? He wondered. During the following week, Charles found himself repeating the scene of calling her and somehow, always hesitating at the last moment. He couldn't understand if he wanted to talk to Shirley out of remorse, or something deeper, something he couldn't define. The truth was that he felt a growing need to redeem himself, to try to reach something that time had stolen from him, but the simple idea of a new encounter made him anxious and uncomfortable. On the other hand, Shirley seemed to live her life with a lightness that he could no longer find. She wasn't looking for him, but that didn't stop her from moving forward with dignity. She, who had always known how to be strong, was now even more independent. Her work routine as a waitress while pregnant seemed to have a clear purpose. She was taking care of herself and her daughter, and that made her stronger. But even she, with all her serenity, couldn't hide the signs of fatigue in her eyes. The weight of motherhood and life alone never left her completely at peace. Shirley knew her journey wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to walk this path. Unlike Charles, she no longer ignored the signs. She knew that, no matter how much Charles's success and wealth might have given him everything he wanted, he had lost something much more precious: love and human connection. She remembered the little things that made him special at the beginning of their marriage, the way he made her laugh, the way he looked at her with affection. But those details had faded over the years, and she knew it wasn't worth waiting for someone who had left her behind. However, something still lingered in her mind. She didn't want to allow herself to feel anything for Charles again. She knew the risk of being hurt again would be too great. Even so, every time she saw her daughter playing alone, without her father's presence, something in her heart tightened. The love she had for him seemed buried, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he was her daughter's father. The pain of seeing him absent from Jessica's life was a constant reminder of what would never be. While Charles, over time, began to wonder if there was still something he could do to fix what he had broken, Shirley no longer allowed herself these questions. She knew that the only person who could save herself was herself. However, The small gestures of kindness and rumors about Charles that began to emerge in her life indicated that he might be trying to change. Doubt grew in her chest, but she didn't want to deceive herself anymore. There was no room for hope amid the pain he had caused. Charles knew that time was against him. The indifference he had shown until that moment now haunted him like a ghost. He tried to convince himself that nothing could be different, but inside himself, he knew something had changed. The question was no longer whether he wanted to change or not, but whether he would be capable of rescuing what he had lost. The morning was rainy and gray, with New York's sky covering the city with a feeling of melancholy. Charles Thompson was sitting at his desk, as always, reviewing contracts and financial reports. But today his eyes weren't focused on the numbers. He was distant, lost in his own thoughts. The encounter with Shirley still echoed in his mind, and the longing for what he had never known how to value consumed him. But what really tormented him now was the realization that things wouldn't be as easy as he imagined. That afternoon, he decided to take action. On impulse, he called Shirley once again. The phone rang several times before she answered, and upon hearing her voice, Charles felt uncomfortable but at the same time hopeful. "Shirley," he began, trying to control the tension in his voice. "I know last time wasn't easy, but I want you to know that I'm different now. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to correct the mistakes I made. You and Jessica deserve something better, and I want to be that man for you." The silence on the other end of the line was almost unbearable. Charles waited, but what came wasn't what he expected. "Charles," she replied with a calm but determined voice, "that's not how things work. You can't simply come back now and expect everything to be resolved with words. You were never good with them. You were never good with feelings." The blow was precise. Each of Shirley's words seemed to cut like a knife. He fell silent, processing what she was saying. She was right. He didn't know how to deal with her feelings, with what she really needed. During all the years of marriage, he only worried about what he wanted and what he needed, completely ignoring her pain, her needs, and her hopes. "Shirley, He tried to defend himself, but she interrupted him. "You don't understand, Charles," she said more firmly. "I can't go back in time, and you can't simply appear, try to fix everything with empty promises. I've lived without you for so long, and I know I can continue like this. I'm strong enough for that." The call ended with a dry sound, leaving Charles there standing, with the phone in his hands. The silence in the room seemed heavy, almost oppressive. He never imagined the response would be so painful. The feeling of frustration took hold of him, like a wave that swallowed him. He was used to having control over things, to molding reality in his favor. But now, he was being forced to face the truth that nothing, absolutely nothing, was under his control. The weight of his guilt crushed him in a way he wasn't prepared to face. He had always had everything within his reach. But now, what he wanted more than anything, Shirley's forgiveness and the chance to know his daughter, seemed beyond his reach. Charles got up from the table and went to his apartment window, looking at New York's busy streets. The rain beat against the glass, making everything even more somber. He had never felt so powerless. No matter how much money he had, or how successful he was in the business world, none of that seemed to matter now. What he really wanted, the love and connection he had neglected for so long, couldn't be bought. In the following days, Charles tried again to approach Shirley, but all his attempts were rejected. He sent flowers, wrote letters, offered financial help, but nothing seemed to break the barrier she had erected around herself. The pain of rejection consumed him, but there was a voice inside him that insisted, "I need to prove I can change. I need to do this for them." But the disappointment he felt was deep. He realized that while he was there, trying to fix the past, Shirley had already moved on. She wasn't waiting for him, and she no longer wanted his help. The truth was before him. Time didn't go back, and the past couldn't be remade. He had failed, and failed in a way he couldn't correct with words or superficial gestures. It was the first time Charles faced the reality of his actions with such clarity. The pain of disappointment didn't come just from Shirley's rejection, but from the fact that he had lost the ability to control the only thing that really mattered, the feelings of people around him. He could no longer make them see him as the man he wanted to be, and that was more painful than any business failure. It was at that moment, with the weight of loneliness and failure upon him, that Charles realized something even deeper. He wasn't just trying to win Shirley back. He was trying to find the person he had lost over the years, the person who, at some point, believed that love and family were more important than any material success. But to find that person, he would need to face himself and reconnect with the humanity he had left behind. The following days dragged on with a growing sense of frustration for Charles. Each attempt to reconnect with Shirley was a closed door. The rejection, more painful than he could imagine, seemed to have a deeper weight than he had ever anticipated. He felt powerless before the wall she had erected around her heart, but at the same time a small flame of hope still burned within him. He knew he needed to do more than simply apologize. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to discover why Shirley had distanced herself so completely, and why now, even with all his inner change, she couldn't forgive him. It was then that, on a Friday afternoon while he was in the office reviewing papers, an idea occurred to him. He couldn't approach her directly, so maybe it was time to seek answers in a different way. He began to discreetly investigate Shirley's life. Charles, with his controlling nature, knew that if he wanted to understand what had really happened, he needed to know more about her routine, about her life, her difficulties. He could no longer depend on assumptions. The first thing he did was look for information about the restaurant where Shirley worked. It wasn't difficult after all, he had a vast network of contacts. In a short time, he learned that the restaurant Le Bonheur was a respected establishment, but one that wasn't in good financial shape. The economic crisis had affected the place, and Shirley had been hired only recently, in a position far below what she deserved. Upon hearing this, something tightened in his chest. He imagined how much she must be struggling to support herself and her daughter, while he lived a life of luxury. The pain of being so distant, so insensitive, tormented him even more. Charles didn't stop there. He learned that in the years following the divorce, Shirley had lived in different neighborhoods of New York, but he wondered what she had done to survive, how she had built a new life for herself and her daughter Jessica. He discovered that Shirley, in fact, hadn't remarried, nor sought another significant relationship. She had dedicated herself completely to raising Jessica, without anyone's help. Charles was surprised to discover that she had started working as a freelance graphic designer while balancing shifts at the restaurant. She was fighting on her own feet, without asking anything from anyone. The admiration he felt for her at that moment was immense, but at the same time the guilt increased. She never needed him, and he wasn't there when she needed him. But there was more. He learned that Shirley had, secretly, bought a small apartment in the Brooklyn neighborhood, with money she managed to save during all those years. And it was at that moment that Charles realized the true depth of the change she had experienced. She had not only distanced herself emotionally from him, but had also built a life without him, without depending on his help. She had created roots in the heart of the city, far from the luxury and artificiality of the worlds he frequented. Charles spent the entire week investigating, increasingly surprised by the way Shirley had reinvented herself. He felt enormous pride in her, but also deep sadness, realizing how much he had left her alone during all those years. She had done everything alone. Each of her achievements had been conquered with great effort and sacrifice, and he just watched her from afar, without realizing what she was really going through. But the biggest shock came when Charles discovered something even more surprising, a detail he could never have imagined. Shirley was, in fact, pregnant again, but it wasn't his. She was expecting the child of a man she had met while working at the restaurant. Charles learned this through a friend who knew the dynamics of the place well. The news hit him like a blow. The vision of Shirley pregnant with a serene look seemed to symbolize a new beginning for her, a beginning that didn't involve him. And while he tried to deal with this, the pain of loss increased. He wondered if he had the right to ask for another chance, or if this was something she had already left behind. He was left with the feeling that his own life, which had always been so planned, was now completely out of control. He didn't know how to react to this new reality. The truth was that he had neglected Shirley, but she had rebuilt her life without him, and with more strength than he ever imagined possible. Now, with the revelation that she was pregnant with another man's child, Charles felt a mixture of envy and regret. He wanted to be able to go back to the moment before the divorce, before the distractions of his own ego. But reality was different. Shirley was no longer waiting for him, and the baby she carried was proof that she had moved on. And the hardest thing for Charles was accepting that he no longer had the power to be the savior. He had failed, and she had found a path that didn't include him. The anguish consumed him for the rest of the day. He knew he couldn't simply go to Shirley and expect her to forgive him. He needed more than that. He needed a real transformation. But above all, he needed to accept that, perhaps, what he wanted now was no longer what she desired. The rain showed no signs of stopping. The windows of his office were fogged by condensation, and the constant sound of water hitting the glass seemed to amplify the feeling of suffocation that Charles was beginning to feel. He had spent days alone in his house, immersed in thoughts and reflections that left him even more distant from who he imagined himself to be. The search for answers about Shirley had left him more lost than ever. The discovery of her pregnancy with another man had affected him unexpectedly, like a bitter reminder of his inability to be present when she really needed him. However, unlike what Charles used to do in uncomfortable situations, he was no longer trying to escape the feelings that arose. He was learning to listen to the pain and accept it, no matter how difficult it was. And it was exactly this pain that forced him to look at life with a new perspective, more truthful and less superficial. However, what he didn't know was that fate still had something greater to reveal to him. The next morning, after a poorly slept night, Charles finally decided to put his plan into practice. He would seek Shirley personally, without more detours, without more empty promises. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever it was, as long as it was an opportunity to show her that he had changed. While preparing to leave, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was firm but not hostile. "My name is Marcus. I am the father of Shirley's daughter." Charles's stomach sank instantly. He tried to hide his surprise, but it was impossible. The only thing he could think was, "What does this mean?" Marcus continued without noticing the agitation on the other side. "I didn't want to get in touch, but after everything we learned about your situation with Shirley, I thought I should be transparent. I know she's pregnant and I've been worried about her. I know she's not ready to talk about it, but I care about her and about the child. If you're trying to approach her in any way, I want to make it clear that I'll be there to protect her." Charles felt a whirlwind of emotions. The first reaction was anger. Who was this man to interfere in Shirley's life now? But at the same time, a feeling of powerlessness took hold of him. He knew Shirley would never choose him again, but hearing those words, especially coming from someone who really cared about her, made the pain of loss even more acute. He realized that the blame for all of this was his. He was no longer in control, and for the first time he felt absolutely vulnerable. "I understand," Charles said, his voice lower than he would like. "I just wanted, try to make things right. But I understand that Shirley has a new life now. I just wanted to know how she was." The conversation was short. Marcus asked Charles to respect Shirley's boundaries, and the call ended without many additional words. But the impact of this discovery was greater than he imagined. He was no longer dealing just with the loss of Shirley, but also with the new reality. She was no longer the woman he knew, the woman he had neglected. She had moved on and built a new life, with someone who respected her, who was by her side in a true way. And this man, Marcus, had no doubts that she was protected and cared for, something Charles couldn't offer at the moment. Deep down, Charles knew he no longer had the right to interfere. This was the first time he really realized that he couldn't simply enter her life and expect everything to be resolved like in a fairy tale. The truth was that he had failed, and there was no going back. He could no longer be the man she needed. But the most painful thing of all was understanding that the change he wanted to see, the transformation he hoped had happened in her, needed to start within him first. He couldn't change the past, but he could change his way of seeing the future. He got up from his chair, looking out the window once more. The rain continued, but this time, he no longer felt anger or frustration. He felt something deeper, more intimate, a feeling of resignation and, paradoxically, of hope. He knew he was ready to take a step in a new direction, not to win Shirley back, but to finally be the person he should always have been, someone who no longer depends on empty words or superficial gestures, but someone who acts with truth, with responsibility. Charles Thompson didn't know what the future would be, but for the first time in many years, he knew what he needed to do. He would start with a simple step: go to the restaurant where Shirley worked, not to ask for forgiveness, but to ask for something even more important, the chance to be a true presence in his daughter Jessica's life. Charles never imagined that a simple gesture of courage could be so difficult to accomplish. The restaurant Le Bonheur was more than just a workplace for Shirley. It was a symbol of the life she had built alone, without him. Charles, however, felt he needed to be there, needed to finally show himself truthfully without the armor he had always worn. But as he approached the restaurant, a feeling of suffocation took hold of him. What was he trying to do? Ask for forgiveness? ask for a second chance, or simply try to justify his years of neglect with empty words. None of this seemed sufficient, but at the same time he couldn't stop walking toward the restaurant. He knew that the shame he felt wouldn't leave him in peace until somehow he surrendered to this pain. When he entered Le Bonheur, the atmosphere was relatively calm, as always. The tables were being set for dinner, and the kitchen was bustling with the agitation of preparations. But something was different, something he couldn't immediately identify. He looked for Shirley until he saw her on the other side of the hall serving a table. She was smiling, attentive to details, taking care of customers with the same serene grace as always. But now, seeing her there, at such a close distance, he felt an even deeper wave of pain. It was as if she were, at the same time, the woman he loved and the woman he had lost forever. When Shirley finally saw him, her smile wavered for a moment. There was no surprise, no anger, just immense serenity, as if she already knew what he wanted. She walked toward him with the same calm as always, without haste, without expectation. "Charles," she said with a soft but firm voice, "what are you doing here?" Her words were like a punch to the stomach. He had no answer. He didn't know what he was doing there. He had reached that point through a mixture of regret, desire for redemption, but also through hope, however remote it might be, that something between them could still be recovered. However, when he saw Shirley's look, there was no room for hope. She was there, perfectly at peace with the life she had built without him. "I wanted to talk to you," Charles said, his voice failing. "I know I made mistakes, and I know there's no way to change the past, but I just wanted you to know that deep down I realized what I did, and I'm deeply sorry. I know I'm no longer the person you knew." Shirley observed him for a long moment. She didn't seem surprised, but there was also no indifference in her look. She didn't seem to be expecting grand promises or justifications. She was just there, ready to listen. But, inside, she had already made peace with the pain he had caused. She had already found peace away from him. "You've already said all this, Charles," she said now with a tone of voice that approached slight sadness, but without resentment. "You've already said you're sorry, and I know you feel that. But the truth is that you can't change anything anymore." She paused as if the words weighed heavily, and he felt tension in his chest. "I'm no longer the woman you left behind," she continued. "I'm no longer that person waiting for you to realize what you did. I've found my path, and my life is mine now. There's no room for more regrets. There's no room for what you imagine could be." The pain was overwhelming. Charles felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He tried to stay firm, but her words, the simple and direct words of a woman who had overcome what he could never imagine, hit him with force. The truth he had always known but never wanted to see was now before him. Shirley didn't need him. She never needed him. She had moved on, and he was somehow being left behind. Lost. Powerless. Now he saw that the biggest mistake of all hadn't been just abandoning Shirley. The biggest mistake of all had been never giving her the freedom to be who she really was, without depending on his validation. Charles fell silent. He didn't know what else to say. He wanted to speak, wanted to convince Shirley that he had changed, that he cared, that he wanted to be present in his daughter's life. But he knew that at that moment, any word that came out of his mouth would be empty. Time couldn't be turned back, and he knew that his actions in the past had defined a limit that couldn't be crossed. "Shirley," he finally said, with a hoarse voice, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to ask you to forgive me." "I don't need you to forgive me," she replied, her voice soft but full of firmness. "I already forgave you a long time ago, Charles. But this doesn't change what I need now, and it doesn't change who I am now." She looked at him once more, and the serenity in her gaze was almost painful. "The only person who can forgive himself now is you," she said, and with those words, she walked away, without haste, without further explanations. She just walked away, leaving Charles there alone in the restaurant with the pain he needed to face. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy. He knew there was nothing more he could do to change what he had lost. And for the first time, he accepted that this was the price he would have to pay. He finally understood that the greatest challenge wasn't winning Shirley back, but learning to live with the mistakes of the past and somehow becoming someone worthy of a new chance. Not with her, but with himself. The days following the encounter at the restaurant Le Bonheur passed slowly, as if each second were an eternity of reflection and pain. Charles tried to deceive himself for years, believing that professional success could compensate for personal failures. But now, reality was relentless. The emptiness couldn't be filled by contracts, real estate, or expensive cars. What he really needed was something much simpler, but infinitely more difficult to achieve: inner peace and the ability to be a better person. However, amid the pain of loss, Charles began to perceive something fundamental. What he was looking for was no longer in winning Shirley back. He couldn't bring her back into his life, and perhaps he would never be deserving of that. What he needed was to learn to be a person of value, a person he could truly be proud of. He knew this would be a long journey, but he was determined to begin. The first step was making a decision that, for a long time, seemed impossible. He would do something for himself. He would no longer wait for a miracle or a second chance. He knew he needed to heal the open wounds he himself had caused, but this required more than an apology. He needed action, and that's what he decided to take. Charles began to get involved in volunteer projects, something that, throughout his life, he had always considered a waste of time. But now he understood that there was more to life than accumulating wealth and achieving more and more success. He looked for a local charity and began to help with whatever was necessary, from fundraising to helping organize events. He, who had always been obsessed with control, now began to learn the value of being humble and acting without expecting anything in return. The most difficult thing, however, was when he encountered the reflection of his change. He still felt the weight of loneliness, but somehow he knew that, by acting to improve other people's lives, he would begin to rebuild his own. He never imagined that true strength didn't come from power or wealth, but from the vulnerability of admitting he wasn't perfect, of accepting his failures and, mainly, of trying to correct mistakes, even if the past couldn't be altered. During one of those days, he met with Marcus, the man who was now part of Shirley's life. Instead of confronting him with anger or jealousy, as he would have done in the past, Charles decided to be honest. They had coffee at a small cafe in downtown Manhattan. Marcus was a simple man, but with an integrity that Charles couldn't help but admire. They didn't talk about Shirley immediately, but during the conversation, Charles realized something important. Marcus wasn't his enemy. He was there to take care of the woman he once loved, and that by itself was a good thing. "I know you have your reservations about me, Charles," Marcus said, with a calm that seemed to dominate the room. "But I want you to know that if Shirley and I decide to follow this path, I'll take care of her. There's nothing more you need to do or say. She's already healed, and you need to do that too." Those words stayed with Charles for a long time, like a deep echo. He felt that, for the first time, he didn't need to be the center of everything. Shirley's life was moving forward, and he no longer had the right to try to control or change it. He needed to focus on his own transformation. The contact with Marcus was the last lesson Charles needed to finally free himself from the weight of the past. He was no longer seeking approval, nor excuses. He was, finally, seeking his own redemption. He understood that being a better person didn't mean fighting to win back who he had lost, but rather accepting that sometimes the best way to love someone was to let the person be happy in their own way. In the following days, Charles continued his routine of volunteer work, and something began to change within him. The work wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. He began to get involved with causes that really mattered, and this made him feel a real connection with the world around him. He no longer needed to hide behind his money or his status. He could be an ordinary person, making a difference in a simple but meaningful way. One night, after a long day of work at the charity shelter, Charles stopped in front of a mirror in his house's bathroom and observed himself for a moment. The man he saw reflected there wasn't the same arrogant man he had known years ago. He wasn't perfect, but he was someone who was trying to make peace with his life, and that, for him, was the beginning of a new journey. And for the first time, he felt deep peace. It wasn't a peace that arose from the expectation that things would work out between him and Shirley. It was an inner peace that came from accepting himself, his failures, and from understanding that, although the past couldn't be erased, the future was still to be built. Winter was beginning to show signs of farewell. New York's cutting cold was beginning to give way to a softer breeze, like a metaphor for the change that was finally settling into Charles's life. He who once believed that power and success were the only things that mattered, now knew that true transformation began within himself. But to break the cycle of pain and regret that had accompanied him for so many years, he needed to take a final step, which wouldn't be easy. After the encounter with Marcus, Charles had withdrawn even more into himself. He had learned to accept that his life wouldn't be defined by the mistakes he had made, but by the choices he would make from then on. The decision he had made to continue with his volunteer work had given him a new perspective, But there was something more he knew he needed to do. Face, once and for all, what he had never wanted to confront. The pain of losing Shirley definitively, without expectations, without illusions. It was late when he decided to go to Shirley's apartment. He had tried to meet with her before, but always felt as if he were chasing something that no longer existed. However, this time was different. He wasn't going to her as the man who still sought to recover what he had lost, but as a man who needed, finally, to free himself from what kept him trapped in the past. When he arrived at the door of the building where she lived, the night was quiet, with New York's silence filled only by the distant sounds of traffic and busy streets. He climbed the stairs, without haste, with a heavy heart, but at the same time with the feeling that something was resolving within him. He knew this encounter would be the last step of a journey he had already begun. He no longer wanted to live attached to a fantasy that he could reverse everything that had happened. He rang the doorbell and waited, the sound of each second being heavier than he imagined. When the door finally opened, Shirley was there. She looked at him for a moment, her expression soft, but with immense seriousness. She didn't seem surprised, but she also wasn't ready to welcome him. She knew, as he knew, that what was about to happen was inevitable. She also felt that this cycle needed to be broken, and he, finally, was ready to do it. "Charles," she said with a calm voice, "what do you want now?" He looked at her, and for the first time didn't see the woman he wanted back, but the woman he had always known she was. Strong, independent, and much more than he could ever be. He no longer saw her as a part of his past, but as someone who had taken control of her life and even so had no resentment. She had been able to move forward, and he needed, finally, to accept that. "Shirley," he said, his voice firm but with a touch of vulnerability he had never before allowed. "I'm here because I need to tell you that I understand now. I understand what happened. I understand what I did, and I understand what you did. You gave me something I never knew how to value, your freedom, your strength, and you don't need me anymore." The words came from his heart, as if they had been stored for years. The pain, anger, and guilt dissipated when he finally surrendered to the truth of what was happening. He was no longer trying to prove anything to her. He was there to end the cycle so that both could finally move forward. "I know I can't go back," he continued, "and I know you don't need more empty words from me. But above all, I wanted you to know that I'm forgiving myself, and I hope that somehow you've done the same." Shirley observed him for a moment, her gaze intense, but without resentment. She breathed deeply, and then gave a small smile. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of understanding. She knew he was being genuine, and that for her was enough. "I already forgave you a long time ago, Charles," she said, with a softness he didn't expect. "But, as you said yourself, now it's about you, and you have to find your way." He looked at her, knowing that at that moment there was a final goodbye that didn't need to be said. The silence between them was no longer painful, but filled with a sense of closure. The pain he felt now was a pain that was part of his transformation. He was no longer running away, no longer trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. He was finally accepting that all he could do now was be a better person, for himself. "I hope you and Jessica are happy," Charles said, with a sincerity that came from the depths of his soul. "I wish you all the best." And without more words, he turned and began to walk away. There was no longer a need for explanations, promises, or proclaiming his own redemption. He finally understood that to free himself from pain, he needed to accept that what had been, had been. What mattered now was the person he was beginning to become. As he left the building, Charles breathed deeply. The night was cold, but he felt an inner warmth, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know exactly what the future held for him, but he knew he was ready to live it, without expectations, without regrets, but with the conviction that he was, finally, breaking the cycle of pain that had imprisoned him. Winter finally gave way to spring. New York's streets, which before seemed cold and distant, were now immersed in a new light. The trees were beginning to bloom, and the air, despite still being fresh, brought a promise of renewal. Charles walked through the streets, now with firmer, lighter steps. There was no longer haste in his walk as before. He knew that the life he had built with his own hands didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be true. And now, he was more prepared to live this truth. In the days that followed his last conversation with Shirley, Charles continued his routine of work at the shelter, but with a new purpose. He was more present, more engaged, and each day, He felt more complete, even though the gaps in his life could never be totally filled. He understood that true success wasn't measured by external achievements, but by the ability to look in the mirror and see someone who was doing the best they could. One afternoon, weeks later, while organizing an event at the shelter, Charles received a call. It was from Shirley. He hesitated for a moment, but the courage he had had until then led him to answer. "Charles," said the voice on the other side. She seemed calm, but there was something different in her tone. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for having finally understood what I needed. I know you've been working to change, and I see that. And for that, I wanted to say that you're on the right path." Those words, simple and direct, were like a balm for him. He never imagined he would hear something like that from Shirley, after everything he had done. The gratitude in her voice reflected more than a simple gesture of kindness. It was the recognition that despite all the failures of the past, Charles was finally acting in a way that reflected the person he should always have been. "Thank you, Shirley," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I really don't know what to say. I just needed you to know how much this means to me." "You don't need to say anything more, Charles," she replied, with a lightness he didn't imagine hearing from her. "I just wanted you to know that, even though our lives have followed different paths, I know you're becoming the man you should be. And that, for me, is enough." The call ended and Charles stood there, in the middle of the room, feeling a peace he didn't imagine was possible. He knew that although he didn't have the right to ask for more from Shirley, she had already given him the most valuable thing, forgiveness and acceptance that he was on a true journey. Months passed, and Charles's life continued to transform. He no longer saw himself as a man in search of something external to fill his emptiness. He found joy in small things, in gestures of kindness, and in real connections with people around him. He began to establish deeper bonds with those who surrounded him, both at the shelter and at work. And despite his life not being perfect, he knew he had something he had never had before: respect for himself. The true new beginning for Charles, however, happened when he was invited to be a mentor for a group of young people in an inclusion program. He had always believed that success was a straight line, with goals to be achieved. But now, he knew that success was a journey full of ups and downs, new beginnings and failures, and mainly learning. One night, while returning home after another meeting in the mentoring program, Charles passed in front of the restaurant Le Bonheur. He hesitated, stopped, and looked at the illuminated entrance. For a moment he saw himself there, in the same place where everything had begun. But this time, there was no pain, no frustration. There was simply a sense of closure, of a cycle that finally had been completed. He smiled to himself, understanding that he no longer needed an answer from the past. He had already found what he was looking for, and it wasn't something that was outside him. The true transformation was in his ability to accept himself, to forgive himself, and to make a difference in other people's lives. And as he continued his way down the street, the city of New York seemed more welcoming, more illuminated. Life, with all its complexities and challenges, was, finally, ahead of him. He didn't have all the answers, but now he knew that the true journey of change began when someone dares to take the first step towards self-knowledge, humility, and the hope that, even in the face of pain, there's always room for a new beginning. Life doesn't always follow the paths we imagine. Often the mistakes of the past haunt us, but it's in accepting them that we find the key to true change. Charles, throughout his journey, learned that it's not perfection that matters, but the courage to get up, recognize one's own mistakes, and seek the truth within oneself. The new beginning doesn't come with grand gestures or promises of immediate happiness, but with